There is a particular sound that old radiators make in winter, a knocking deep in the pipes like something trying to remember how to be warm. I used to lie awake counting those knocks instead of counting sheep, because sheep felt like something other people got to have. Soft, safe things. I had pipes complaining in a building that wasn't mine, in a bed that wasn't mine, under a roof that 31 other Omegas and I shared because none of us had anywhere else to go. The Hearthlight Omega shelter sat at the edge of the city where the streetlights started skipping. One lit, one dark, one lit, one dark, like the city itself couldn't decide whether we deserved to be seen. I'd lived there 11 months by the time the letter came, the one that changed everything, though of course I didn't know that yet. On the morning it arrived, I was on my knees in the laundry room scrubbing a stain out of someone else's coat, my knuckles raw, my mind very deliberately empty. Because an empty mind doesn't ache the way a full one does. I want to tell you who I was before I tell you what happened, because the two halves of my life don't fit together unless you understand the seam. My name is Claude Greer. I was 24 years old, an Omega with no pack, no family that would claim me, and a heart that I had folded up so many times it had begun to tear along the creases. I had a scent that the other Omegas said was like rain on hot stone, which sounds romantic until you understand that an Omega's scent, unclaimed and unbonded, is a kind of vulnerability you wear on your skin. I covered mine with suppressant patches and cheap soap and the particular flatness of a person who has decided that wanting things is dangerous. I had wanted things once. I had wanted one thing, one person, so completely that the wanting had nearly killed something in me when it ended. But I am getting ahead of the seam. Let me stay in the laundry room a little longer, because that is where the ordinary days lived, and I think ordinary days deserve to be honored before the extraordinary ones come crashing through the door. The shelter ran on donations on the goodwill of a city that mostly preferred not to think about where Omegas went when their packs discarded them or their mates rejected them. Or their bodies betrayed them with a heat they couldn't survive alone. We had a kind matron named Benaz, who ran the place like a general with a soft heart, and we had each other, which on good days felt like enough. That particular morning, Benaz came into the laundry room with an envelope held against her chest, the way you'd hold something that might still be breathing. "Claude," she said. Her voice had a tremor in it I'd never heard before. "Come look at this." I dried my hands on my apron and took the envelope from her. Inside was a letter from the shelter's bank informing us that an anonymous donor had transferred enough money to not only clear our debts but to fund a complete renovation, a medical wing, and an endowment that would keep Hearthlight running for the next decade without a single fundraiser. I read the number twice, then a third time, because numbers like that don't belong in buildings with knocking radiators. Anonymous, Benna said, like the word itself was a small miracle. No name, no conditions, just a wire transfer and a note that said, and I quote, "For every Omega who needs somewhere to land." I felt something in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet, a small and unfamiliar lift, like a window opening in a room I'd thought was sealed. I didn't know that the hand which had signed that transfer belonged to the only alpha I had ever let myself love. I didn't know that somewhere across the city, in an office with too much glass and too little warmth, that alpha was staring at his own signature and thinking about an Omega he had spent 2 years trying not to think about. I just knew that for the first time in 11 months, the radiators didn't sound quite so lonely. I should tell you about Bill Weeks, because even though I am the one telling this story, he is the reason there is a story at all. I met him 3 years before that envelope arrived, at a charity auction I had no business attending, working as catering staff in a uniform 2 sizes too big. I remember the exact moment our scents crossed each other in that crowded ballroom, because my whole body simply stopped what it was doing and turned, the way a compass needle turns without asking permission. He was an alpha built like a door someone had carved into a person, broad through the shoulders, with a quietness to him that the loud men in that room mistook for arrogance. It wasn't arrogance. I learned later that it was grief, an old grief about a mother he'd lost too young, and a father who measured love in contracts. But in that first moment, all I knew was that he smelled like cedar after rain, and that my whole skin had gone electric with a longing I had no permission to feel. He found me by the kitchen doors 20 minutes later, holding 2 glasses of water like an apology for something neither of us had done yet. "You're not supposed to be back here," I told him, because I was 21 and terrified, and that fear came out as something close to rudeness. "Neither are you, technically," he said. I asked the host where the wine cellar was. He told me, "You're the wine cellar." It was a terrible line. I laughed anyway, the first real laugh I'd had in months, and something in his face cracked open at the sound of it, soft and unguarded in a way I would spend the next 2 years falling in love with. We didn't become anything that night. He was an alpha with a family name stitched into half the buildings downtown, and I was an unclaimed omega with no name worth stitching anywhere. But he found reasons to be wherever I was working after that. He learned my schedule before I admitted I'd noticed him learning it. He brought me coffee that he pretended he'd bought for himself and then claimed not to want. He was, for an alpha raised among people who treated affection like currency, almost unbearably gentle, as though he was terrified that anything stronger than gentleness would frighten me away. It took him 4 months to kiss me, on a rooftop in late autumn with the city laid out below us like a field of low gold stars. It took him another 6 to claim me as his slow and reverent, his teeth at the curve of my neck, so careful that I had to ask him twice to stop being so careful, to let himself want me the way I so plainly wanted him. I remember the bond settling into place like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known was there. I remember thinking with a certainty that felt like bedrock, that whatever happened to me after that moment, I would never again be entirely alone, because some part of him now lived in some part of me. A low, warm hum under my ribs that I could feel even when he was across the city, even when he was asleep, even when eventually he was gone. That is the part I have to tell you now. The part where the bedrock cracked. His father, a man named Edric Weeks, who treated his son's bonding the way a general treats a captured city, decided that an unclaimed kitchen omega with no family and no fortune was not a partner, but a liability. I never learned the exact mechanics of what was done to us. I only know that I woke up one morning, and the hum under my ribs was still there, faint and aching. But Bill was gone, and in his place was a letter in a handwriting I didn't recognize as his, telling me that he had been wrong, that the bond had been a mistake, born of youth and proximity, that he was sorry, that he hoped I would find someone who could give me what he never truly could. I did not know, then, that the letter was a forgery. I did not know that Edric Weeks had told his son a parallel lie, that I had taken a payment and disappeared, that I had never wanted the bond at all and had simply been waiting for the right price to walk away. I did not know that for 2 years, Bill Weeks believed I had abandoned him for money the way his father had always warned him an unclaimed omega eventually would, and that this belief had hollowed him out as thoroughly as my own had hollowed me. I only knew the hum under my ribs had gone quiet, like a radio losing its signal, and that an unclaimed omega whose alpha rejects the bond does not simply heal from that. The body remembers what the mind is told to forget. I spent the better part of a year unable to hold food down, unable to trust my own scent glands, unable to walk past a man who smelled even faintly of cedar without my knees buckling beneath me. By the time I found my way to Hearthlight, I had stopped believing love was a thing that happened to people like me on purpose. I had decided it was an accident, a weather event, something that arrived and departed without consultation, and that the only sensible response was to build a roof sturdy enough to survive the next storm without expecting shelter from anyone else. I did not know that the storm I had survived was about to come looking for me again, gentler this time, and asking, for the first time, to be let in rather than simply taken. Hearthlight changed after the donation, slowly, and then all at once, the way spring does. Within 2 months, we had a new roof that didn't leak into the east hallway. Within 4, a proper medical wing with an omega physician named Dr. Iset, who didn't flinch at scarred scent glands or the particular silence of trauma. Within 6, the knocking radiators were finally, blessedly, replaced. I want to tell you about the people I lived with there, because they are not background to my story. They are the reason I survived long enough to have one. There was Priya, who had 3 children and a laugh like a struck bell, who taught me to braid hair tightly enough to survive a windstorm and loosely enough to feel like being held. There was old Tomas, technically an Omega elder, though everyone forgot the word elder existed when he was in the room cracking jokes about his hip replacement. There was a younger Omega named Ren, who had arrived 4 months after me 17, and shaking, who I found myself fiercely protectively attached to in a way that surprised me, because I had thought my capacity for that kind of feeling had been used up. We built something there that I had not expected to build again, a pack of sorts, not bonded by blood or by claim, but by the simple accumulated weight of choosing each other every single day. We cooked together in a kitchen that no longer smelled like other people's anxiety. We celebrated small things with the ferocity of people who had learned that small things were not guaranteed. When Ren finished her first semester of community college paid for by the new scholarship fund the anonymous donation had created, we threw her a party with a cake that Priya iced badly and lovingly. And I cried in the pantry afterward, not from sadness, but from the strange vertigo of unexpected joy. I want you to understand that by the time the gala invitation came, I had built a life. A small one, modest, contained within the walls of a shelter that had become, against every odd, something close to home. I was not waiting for anyone. I had stopped waiting, somewhere in that second year, the way you stop waiting for a kettle you've taken off the stove. But the body keeps its own ledgers, separate from the mind's accounting. Sometimes late at night, the hum under my ribs would flicker back to life for no reason. I could name faint as a heartbeat heard through a wall, and I would lie very still and let myself wonder. Just for a few minutes before I forced the thought away, whether bonds truly die the way grief insists they do, or whether they simply go to sleep waiting for the right hand to wake them. I did not let myself hope. Hope, I had learned, is expensive, and I had already paid more than I could afford once. It started, as these things often do, with paperwork. Benyas called a meeting of the senior residents, of which I had somehow become one 11 months into my stay, and now a kind of unofficial deputy who helped with intake and budgeting. She wanted to send a formal letter of gratitude to the anonymous donor, routed through the bank's legal department, with no name attached, but with our thanks made plain. I want every resident who's willing to contribute a sentence, she said. Something true, something that shows them what their money actually did, not just what it bought. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. I wrote a sentence I did not expect to mean as much as it did. You gave me back the version of myself that still believes in mornings. I didn't think about who would read it. I assumed, as we all did, that the letter would land on a desk somewhere, get filed, and disappear into the particular anonymity that wealthy donors often prefer, a kindness performed at a safe and bloodless distance. What I did not know was that the donor had specifically requested updates, quiet ones, irregular ones, but real ones, photographs of the new medical wing, attendance numbers for the scholarship program, the occasional anecdote Benaz felt comfortable sharing. I did not know that a man across the city had taken to reading these updates alone in his office at night. The door locked, his tie loosened, something in his chest loosening along with it for the first time in 2 years. I did not know that my single sentence about mornings had been read by Bill Weeks 4 times in a row, and that he had then sat very still in his office chair, staring at handwriting he did not recognize. Feeling an ache he could not explain, settle behind his sternum like weather. He did not know it was my handwriting. He had no reason to suspect that the Omega he had spent 2 years trying to forget was living, breathing, healing 6 miles from his office. He only knew that something about that sentence had cracked him open the way nothing had in 2 years, and that he found himself against every instinct his father had drilled into him, wanting to see the place that had produced it. That want became an invitation, The shelter, flush with new funds and a board eager to show donors what their generosity had built, decided to host a small gala, an evening of thanks disguised as a fundraiser, inviting major contributors to tour the new facilities. The anonymous donor was, of course, the guest of honor. Though his identity remained sealed even from the board, his presence to be arranged through his own representatives. I had no reason to think this gala concerned me beyond the obligation of attendance. Benaz asked several of the senior residents, myself included, to be present, to speak briefly if we felt comfortable, to put a human face on the numbers the donors had funded. I said yes, because I had learned, in my year at Hearthlight, that gratitude is a muscle you have to use or it atrophies. I did not know I would be standing in a room, 3 weeks later, face to face with the one alpha whose absence had taught my body what grief tastes like. In the weeks before the gala, I found myself thinking about Bill more than I had allowed myself to in over a year. It wasn't deliberate, it was the kind of intrusion grief specializes in, arriving sideways through unrelated doors. I would catch a whiff of cedar from a stranger's coat on the street and have to stop walking. My hand pressed flat against my own chest, as though I could physically hold the memory still long enough to examine it before it dissolved. I would wake at 3 in the morning with the ghost sense of a hand at the small of my back, warm and absent at once, and lie there until dawn, convincing myself it was only memory, not the bond stirring, because the bond was supposed to be dead, because believing otherwise was a door I had nailed shut for my own survival. I wrote him letters during those weeks, though I never intended to send them. I wrote them the way some people pray, not because they expect an answer, but because the act of speaking the unspeakable thing keeps it from rotting inside you. I don't know if you ever think about me, one letter said. I think the worst part isn't that you left, it's that I still, after everything, hope you didn't want to. I built a life without you, another said. I want you to know that. I am not the person who fell apart on your kitchen floor anymore. But some nights I still reach for a version of you that I know isn't real, and I hate that I can't make my body understand what my mind already knows. I never sent these letters. I folded them into a shoebox under my narrow shelter bed, a private archaeology of a grief I had promised myself I was past. I told no one about them, not even Priya, who could read my moods like weather and who, more than once, asked me gently if something was wrong, only to be met with my best impression of fine. I did not know that across the city, a man who had once been my whole world was writing letters of his own, equally unsent, equally desperate, addressed to an Omega he believed had taken his father's money and vanished. His letters were angrier than mine, full of a betrayal he had built an entire identity around. But underneath the anger, if you had asked me to guess, I think they would have sounded exactly like mine. Two people, mourning the same dead bond, each blaming themselves for a death neither of us had actually caused. The night before the gala, I took my letters out of the shoebox and read every single one. Then, for reasons I couldn't fully explain even to myself, I didn't put them back. I burned them in the kitchen sink, watched the paper curl black and then to ash, and told myself I was finally letting go. I had no idea I was about to walk into the one room in the city where letting go was about to become impossible again. The night of the gala, Hearthlight transformed itself into something I'd barely recognized. String lights threaded through the courtyard trees, tables draped in soft cream linen. The new medical wing, gleaming and finished, open for tours, its hallways smelling of fresh paint instead of mildew for the first time in the building's history. I wore the only good shirt I owned. A deep green Priya insisted brought out something warm in my eyes, and I stood near the entrance to the courtyard, greeting donors with a practiced, careful warmth. The kind you learn to perform even when your real feelings are folded up small and tucked somewhere safer. I felt him before I saw him. That is the only honest way to describe it. The hum under my ribs, the one I had spent 2 years insisting was dead, surged up so suddenly and so violently that I had to grip the edge of a nearby table to keep my knees from giving out. My whole body turned toward the courtyard entrance, the way it had turned 3 years earlier in that crowded ballroom. Except this time, the longing arrived with an undertow of terror so strong, I nearly fled before I even confirmed what my body already knew. Cedar, Rain, him. He stood in the entrance in a charcoal suit that fit him the way money fits people who've never had to think about money, taller than I remembered, leaner in the face with a stillness to him that read, to anyone who didn't know him, as composure. I knew him. I knew that stillness was the sound of a man holding himself together by main force. He saw me at the exact moment I saw him. I watched the recognition hit him in stages, the way a wave hits a shoreline. First confusion, his brow furrowing at a face he hadn't expected to find in this building. Then the scent, arriving a half-second behind the visual, because scent always travels slower through grief-numbed senses than it should. Then his whole body went rigid, the glass of champagne in his hand tilting dangerously, his lips parting around a name he hadn't said aloud in 2 years, Claude. It wasn't a question. It was an exhale, the sound of a held breath finally given somewhere to go. I should tell you what I felt in that moment, though I'm not certain I have the vocabulary for it even now. It was not simple. It was not the clean joy of a reunion in a story written by someone who hadn't lived through the version that actually hurts. It was joy and rage arriving in the same breath, love and betrayal occupying the same square inch of my chest, my body singing toward him on instinct while my mind screamed at me to run. You're the donor, I said, because it was easier to say than any of the things I actually felt. You're the anonymous donor. He set the champagne glass down on the nearest surface without looking at it, his eyes never leaving my face, as if looking away might make me disappear the way I apparently had once already, in a story he had been told and had no reason to question. You live here, he said. His voice had gone rough, stripped of the polish I remembered. You've been living here this whole time. 11 months, I said. My own voice was shaking, and I hated it. Hated that 2 years of careful, deliberate healing could be undone by one syllable of his voice saying my name. 11 months, Bill. He flinched at the name, my use of it, like it was a wound reopening rather than a word. I didn't know, he said. Claude, I swear to every god that exists, I had no idea you were here. I would have. You would have what? The rage arrived fully now, hot and clean, cutting through the longing like a knife through warm wax. Sent a different anonymous check? Made sure your donation went somewhere safely, far away from the Omega you rejected? I never rejected you. The words landed in the space between us like something dropped from a great height. I stared at him, at the raw, wrecked sincerity on his face, and felt the ground under my carefully reconstructed life begin, for the second time in my life, to shift. We did not have that conversation in the courtyard, surrounded by string lights and donors sipping champagne and bananas somewhere nearby. Beaming with pride at a gala she did not yet know was about to become the site of my personal earthquake. Bill found a way, with the smooth efficiency of a man who had spent his entire life managing rooms, to extract us both into the small office near the new medical wing, the one Dr. Torsek I set used for consultations, currently empty, the door able to close on the noise of celebration outside. He shut it carefully behind us, as though loud sounds might shatter something fragile in the air between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stood with my arms crossed over my chest, putting as much distance between us as the small room allowed, my whole body still ringing with the proximity of him. The bond under my ribs no longer a faint hum, but a full, undeniable chord. Tell me what you think happened, he said finally. I need to know what you were told. Before I say anything else, I need to know what you believe, I told him. I told him about the letter, the handwriting I hadn't recognized, the apology that had read like a closing argument rather than a confession. I told him about the year I couldn't keep food down, the way my own scent glands had betrayed me with grief, the slow, brutal climb back to something resembling a functioning person. His face, through all of it, went through a transformation I will never forget. Confusion first. Then, a dawning, sick horror. By the time I finished, he had pressed both hands flat against the desk behind him, as though he needed it to hold himself upright. "That's not what happened," he said, and his voice had gone hollow in a way I had never heard from him, not even in our worst arguments back when arguments were a thing we could afford to have. "Claude, that's not the letter I was told you sent." "What letter?" "My father told me you'd taken a payment," he said. "A settlement, to formally dissolve the bond and disappear. He showed me a document with your signature on it. He told me you'd called the bond a mistake, that you'd never wanted to be claimed by someone like me, that you'd simply been waiting for the price to be right." The room tilted. I had to sit down in the single chair Dr. Iset kept for patients, my legs no longer trustworthy beneath me. "I never signed anything," I said. "Bill, I never even saw your father after the night I woke up and you were gone. I never spoke to him." "I know," he said, and the word came out broken, splintering at the edges. "I know that now. I think I've known it for longer than I've let myself admit. I spent 2 years hating a version of you that I'm starting to understand never existed." He told me, then, in pieces that came out of him like something being physically extracted, about the 2 years that had followed our separation. About the letter his father had shown him, forged with a precision that suggested Edric Weeks had access to resources neither of us could have imagined fighting against. About the way Bill had thrown himself into the family business with a kind of grim, joyless efficiency, building wealth he didn't want for a life he'd stopped believing he deserved to enjoy. About the night 8 months ago when he'd finally found the courage to confront his father directly, only to be met with a casual, almost bored confirmation that yes, the letters had been arranged, that an unclaimed Omega with no family was not in Edric Weeks's calculation worth the complications a real bond would have introduced into a strategic merger his father had been negotiating with another family at the time. "He'd already arranged my marriage," Bill said, the words coming out flat with old fury. "Before I'd even told him about you. He just needed you gone first." I sat very still, feeling the architecture of my entire grief rearrange itself around a truth I hadn't been prepared to receive. I had spent 2 years believing I had been a brief, disposable mistake to a man who had simply tired of me. I had built an entire identity around surviving that rejection. And now, I was being asked to understand that the rejection itself had been a manufactured lie, that the bond I had mourned as dead had simply been buried alive by someone else's hand. "Why are you telling me this now?" I said, "and not at any point in the last 2 years?" "Because I didn't know where you were," he said. "Because I spent 2 years believing you didn't want to be found. And because the moment I learned the truth about my father, I started looking for you anyway, even believing what I believed. Because some part of me apparently never stopped wanting to find you, regardless of the reason." "Chair. And the donation," I said. "Hearthlight." Something shifted in his face, something almost shy beneath the raw devastation of the last few minutes. "I started donating to Omega shelters across the city about a year ago," he said, all anonymous. "I told myself it was guilt, atonement, something abstract and self-serving like that. I didn't let myself examine it too closely. But I think, if I'm honest, some part of me was always hoping that one of these places might somehow lead me back to you. I didn't dare hope it outright. I just kept giving, kept looking, in whatever quiet way I thought I could survive." "You found me," I said, "by accident." "I don't think it was an accident," he said. "I think I would have found you eventually no matter what, because some part of me has never stopped looking, even when I told myself I'd stopped." I did not know what to do with the size of that confession. I sat in Dr. Iset's small office with the gala noise muffled behind the door, my whole body aching with a longing I had spent 2 years convincing myself I'd outgrown, and felt the first dangerous flicker of something I had sworn off entirely. Hope. We talked for almost an hour in that office, the gala continuing without us, Behnaz no doubt wondering where her 2 most important guests had disappeared to. I will not recount every word of it, because some conversations belong only to the people who had them, but I will tell you the shape of what passed between us, because the shape matters. He told me about his father's empire, the family business built on alliances and leverage rather than affection, and the particular loneliness of growing up inside it. He told me about his mother who had died when he was 12, and Omega who had been by every account he'd gathered since. Deeply and quietly unhappy in a bond his father had also engineered for strategic reasons rather than love. He told me he had sworn as a boy standing at her funeral that he would never let himself become his father, and how it had nearly broken him to discover 2 years ago that he had let his father destroy the one bond he'd formed entirely on his own terms, the one thing in his life that hadn't been arranged or leveraged or bought. "I should have fought harder," he said. "I should have demanded to see you myself instead of believing a piece of paper my father handed me. I think some small, cowardly part of me wanted to believe it, because believing you'd left me for money was easier than believing my own father was capable of destroying the only good thing I'd ever built." I told him, in turn, about the year I couldn't function, the suppressant patches, the slow climb back through Hearthlight's doors and into something resembling a self again. I told him about Priya and Ren and old Tomas, about the family I had built out of necessity and had come, against every expectation, to genuinely love. I told him about the shoebox of unsent letters, burned the night before, ash in a kitchen sink, a goodbye I had thought was final. "I burned the letters because I thought I was finally letting you go," I said. "And then you walked into the courtyard, and I understood that I'd been lying to myself the entire time." He reached across the small space between us then, slowly, carefully, the way you'd reach toward something you were terrified of frightening away. His fingers stopped just short of my hand, hovering, asking permission with a restraint that nearly undid me more than any grand gesture could have. "I'm not asking you to forgive 2 years in one conversation," he said. "I know that isn't how this works. I know what was done to you, even if I didn't do it myself, and I know that doesn't erase the damage. I just need you to know that I am not the man who wrote that letter, and I am not the man who walked away from you. I am the man who has been looking for you, without knowing it was you, for longer than I want to admit." I looked at his hand, hovering there in the space between us, and felt the bond under my ribs ache with a longing that 2 years of careful armor had failed to extinguish. I did not take his hand that night. I want to be honest about that, because this is not a story where everything resolves itself in a single tearful confession. I told him I needed time, that the body does not forget 2 years of grief just because the mind has been handed a better explanation for it, and he nodded, his jaw tight with the effort of accepting a boundary he clearly wanted to dissolve. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I'm not going to disappear again. I'm not going to let anyone convince me to disappear again." I went back to my room at Hearthlight that night and did not sleep at all. I lay in the dark listening to the new, quiet radiators and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the terrifying, fragile shape of hope settling into the space my grief had hollowed out. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories that skip the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust do a disservice to anyone who has actually had to do it. Bill did not push. That, more than anything, is what began to thaw something in me. He sent no grand gestures, no extravagant gifts, none of the performative apology I might have expected from a man with his resources. Instead, he asked Banaz, through proper channels, whether he might be permitted to volunteer at the shelter, doing maintenance work on the new wing, nothing that required proximity to residents who hadn't agreed to it. He showed up in old work clothes, hands going rough and calloused in a way that startled the staff, who had expected, I think, a donor who wrote checks rather than one who fixed leaking pipes. He did not seek me out directly. He let me find him, slowly, on my own terms, in the kitchen on a Tuesday, when I came in for tea and found him repairing a cabinet hinge that had been broken since before I'd arrived. He looked up, startled, and then deliberately did not move toward me, did not crowd the space, simply said quietly, "I can leave if you'd rather not see me right now," and waited for my answer instead of assuming it. "You can stay," I said, surprising myself. We talked, that day, about nothing important. The hinge, the weather, Ren's upcoming exams. It was such a small, ordinary conversation that I found myself laughing briefly at something he said about his own disastrous attempts at home repair as a teenager. And the sound of my own laughter startled me almost as much as it visibly moved him. These small, ordinary moments accumulated over weeks. He came twice, then 3 times a week, always with Banaz's permission, always careful never to make any resident uncomfortable, always letting me set the pace of whatever was happening between us. I watched him with Ren, gentle and patient when she asked him nervous questions about whether all alphas were like the one who'd hurt her family. I watched him with old Thomas, who took an instant, mischievous liking to him and spent an entire afternoon interrogating him about his intentions with a thoroughness that would have terrified a lesser man. I watched the careful, deliberate way he rebuilt not just trust with me, but a relationship with the entire fragile ecosystem of people I had come to love. It was Priya who finally said what I think we both already knew. "You're allowed to want this," she told me one evening, watching me watch him through the kitchen window as he helped Thomas carry firewood. "You spent 2 years convinced wanting things was dangerous. But Claude, that man drives 40 minutes out of his way 3 times a week to fix hinges nobody asked him to fix, because it's the only way he's found to be near you without frightening you off. That's not danger. That's devotion, learning to be patient." I did not run to him that night with some dramatic declaration. That is not who I am, and it would not have been honest to the slow work we'd both been doing. But I did the next time he came asking to stay, after his volunteer shift ended, and we sat together on the back steps of the shelter as the sun went down close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. And I let myself for the first time in 2 years simply exist next to him without flinching. "I'm not ready to be claimed again," I told him honestly. "I don't know if I ever will be, the way things were before. But I think I'm ready to find out who we could be now, slowly, if you're willing to go slowly." "I have spent 2 years going nowhere at all," he said. "Slowly sounds like the fastest thing I've moved in years." I will tell you about the night the bond woke fully, because I think it deserves to be told with the gentleness it actually contained, rather than the breathless urgency these stories sometimes demand. It was nearly 4 months after the gala. Spring had arrived properly by then, the kind of spring that makes even old grief feel survivable, green pushing up through every crack in the shelter's courtyard pavement. Bill had, by this point, become something close to a fixture at Hearthlight, not just for me, but for all of us. His work boots permanently muddy, his once pristine hands now scarred with small careless cuts from amateur carpentry. A transformation that Priya liked to tease him about, mercilessly, and that he bore with a good humor. I don't think his old life had ever allowed him. We had taken, by then, to walking together in the evenings, along the river path 2 blocks from the shelter, talking about nothing and everything, rebuilding the easy intimacy we'd once had piece by careful piece. On this particular evening, the air smelled like cut grass and the first true warmth of the year, and he reached for my hand the way he had begun to, tentatively, always ready to let go if I pulled away. I did not pull away. I laced my fingers through his instead, deliberately, and felt the bond under my ribs surge up in response, no longer a faint hum or a flicker, but a full resonant chord, as though some long dormant instrument had finally been properly tuned. He stopped walking entirely, his breath catching, his eyes going wide and unguarded in a way I had only seen once before, on a rooftop years ago under a field of low gold stars. "You feel that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I feel it," I said. "I think I'd been feeling it the whole time underneath everything. I just didn't trust it to be real." "Is it real?" he asked, and I understood that he wasn't asking about the bond. He was asking about us, about whether the slow months of hinges and firewood and patient distance had built something sturdy enough to hold what came next. I answered him not with words, but by closing the distance between us, my hand coming up to rest against his jaw, feeling the slight rough scrape of stubble he'd stopped bothering to shave away on volunteer days. Feeling him hold so still beneath my touch that I understood he was terrified of doing anything that might make me retreat. "I want to try," I told him. Not because the bond is asking us to, because I am asking, and I think you are too. And I think that's the difference between what happened before and what could happen now. What followed I will tell with the privacy it deserves, because some moments are not meant to be narrated in full, only honored in the telling that they happened. He kissed me first, soft and questioning, giving me every chance to stop him. And when I didn't stop him, when I pressed closer instead. The kiss deepened into something that carried 2 years of separate grief, finally finding a shared resolution. We walked back to a small apartment he kept near the river, not his family's grand house. A place he told me he'd bought quietly a year ago for reasons he hadn't let himself examine too closely until that exact moment, and there slowly. With a tenderness that made up for every gentleness the world had denied us, we found our way back to each other. I will only say that when his teeth found the curve of my neck again, at the old claim mark that had never fully faded, the bond beneath my ribs did not simply wake. It sang, full and certain, as though it had simply been waiting, patient as a seed beneath snow, for both of us to choose it freely this time, with open eyes and no father's lie standing between us. Afterward, in the quiet dark of that small apartment, he held me against his chest, and I felt his heartbeat settle into the same rhythm as my own, the way it had years before on that rooftop, before either of us had any reason to doubt it would last. I am never letting anyone tell either of us a lie like that again, he said into my hair. Not my father, not anyone. I will spend the rest of my life proving that to you, if that's what it takes. I believe you, I said, and understood with a settled certainty that had nothing left in it of fear, that I meant it. I want to tell you what happened after, because I think happy endings deserve their details too, not just their declarations. Bill severed every formal tie to his father's business within a year, a decision that cost him a fortune he didn't particularly miss and gained him a peace he said he hadn't known was possible. He used a portion of what remained to formally endow Hearthlight permanently this time, without anonymity, standing beside Ben Naz at a small ceremony with his name finally openly attached to the cause. Because he said he was done hiding the parts of his life that mattered most. I stayed at Hearthlight too, not as a resident any longer, but as something closer to a permanent member of staff, helping new arrivals find their footing the way Priya and Tomas had once helped me find mine. Ren graduated eventually and came back to volunteer on weekends, and I watched her teach a frightened new arrival how to braid hair tightly enough to survive a windstorm, the same lesson Priya had once given me. Passed forward like something precious, handed hand to hand down a long line of people learning to heal. Bill and I took our bonding slowly, the way we'd promised each other we would, but slowly does not mean never. 2 years after that gala, we held a small ceremony in the Hearthlight courtyard, under the same string lights that had been hung the night we found each other again, surrounded by Priya and Tomas and Ren and Dr. Tokter, Iset and Benaz, who cried more than anyone and denied it fiercely afterward. I do not know how to fully explain what it feels like to have a bond die once mourn it as dead, and then watch it return, not as the same thing it was before, but as something new built from the wreckage with more care than the original ever had. I think if I had to try, I would say it feels like the radiators in an old building finally going quiet, not because the building has stopped being warm, but because the warmth no longer has to fight so hard to be felt. Some nights, even now, I still wake at 3 in the morning out of old habit, my hand reaching instinctively for the empty space beside me that for 2 years was never actually empty in the way grief insisted it was. Except now, the space isn't empty at all. Bill is there, warm and solid and entirely, deliberately chosen, his arm tightening around me even in sleep, as though some part of him is still standing guard against the possibility of losing me again. I used to believe love was an accident, a weather event that arrived and departed without consultation. I have come to believe something gentler now. I think love, the kind that survives lies and separation and years of manufactured grief, is not an accident at all. I think it is a choice made and remade every single ordinary day in hinges fixed and firewood carried and hands offered without demand. Until one day you look up and realize the storm you spent so long building shelter against was never the danger at all. The danger was believing you didn't deserve to come in out of the rain. I deserved it. He deserved it. And on the nights when the city outside our window goes quiet and the only sound left is his heartbeat steady beneath my ear, I let myself believe fully and without fear that we have both finally found our way home. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.